Hello everyone, it's Mr. G, and I'm here to bring you the next lesson, lesson 8 of the Java Beginners tutorial. And lesson 8 is going to be on arrays. But before I get into arrays and what arrays are, I wanted to just quickly show you guys using a for loop and a while loop with a double value instead of just using integers. So we'll start with the while loop. So we can create a double value and we'll call it x, and let's set it to 1.4. And then we can set up our while loop. So the while keyword, and in our parentheses we'll have while x is greater than 0. Let's say while x is greater than -1. Then we will do system.out.println, and we'll do x. And after that, we have to change the value of x so we can eventually break out of the loop. So we'll do x equals x minus 0.1. All right, and so it will set it to 1.4 initially, and while x is greater than -1, we want to print it and then subtract 0.1 from x, and that'll change the value of it, and eventually it'll get to the point where it's less than -1, and or while it's not greater than -1, and then we can see what happens from there. So let's go ahead and run it, and we have some weird output here, and this is kind of the issue that you'll run into with doubles if you don't properly handle this. But we have 1.4, then 1.3, then 1.2, 1.1. So it is subtracting 0.1 each time. And we get to 0.9, negative 0.9 here. And that's the last time that we'll have a value that is greater than -1. The next time we subtract 0.1, we'll have -1. So, and -1 is not greater than -1, so we'll break out of the loop, and that ends the program. So that's the example with a while loop. For a for loop, so we have the word for here, and I'm just not going to use, not going to create any variable here. I'm just going to use the double x that I've already created. And while x, and this is going to do the exact same thing, is greater than -1, x minus equals 0.1. And if you remember, this minus equals is the same thing as doing x equals x minus 0.1. And so we're going to start with x as is, and while x is greater than -1, we're going to subtract 1, and we're just going to print out the value, I need to do line there, of x. Alright, and we run that and got the same output. So you can use doubles in your loops. I know I briefly mentioned that yesterday, but I didn't show any examples. So now you have examples, and we can move on to arrays. So what are arrays? Well, an array is basically a collection of a data type, essentially. You can think of them kind of like, almost like a warehouse. And in the warehouse, you have different shelves that and racks that you can put boxes on, and each rack is going to have its own number or way to find it. And it's done like that so you can stay organized and find the information, or find the products that you're trying to get. So arrays are the same way. So to explain this and help you visualize what I mean, I'm going to open up Paint here, and I'll draw it. I guess this is fine. All right, so let's grab this, Okay, and just make little boxes here. They're not all the same size, but that's okay. All right, grab our pencil, get a big, yeah, that's good. All right, so another like way to think about it is like a street and each box is a house and they all have their own address. And in each box or each house we can put things in, or if it's a house you can think of it as a family can live there, or an individual or whatever. Arrays are the same way, and they each have their own address. And so let's say this is an integer array. Okay, this one might have the number 2 stored in there. This one might have -16. This index might have 3. This index, and notice I'm calling them indexes, and that's their address, or the location of the box that we're talking about. So these are all separate variables, but they're all stored in one variable here, which is the array. So this one could be 24, 19, and maybe 0. All right, now you might be wondering to yourself, well, how do I access this element specifically, this index here? And that's where the addresses come in. So just like your street address, each one of these boxes has an address, and it's always the same. It always starts at 0, 1, 2, so on and so forth. Okay? So if I wanted to get the contents of this box, then I will look for index 1, call index 1 of this array, and then I'll get that. I can actually change the value here, and this can become 18, let's just say. And when I call index 1, I'll get 18 or -18. And that'll be that's the value that's contained within here, and that's what I'm going to get. And it's the same thing with any of these other ones. Now you can have some errors or some issues where if you look for an element or index that is not within the array. So if I tried to get element number 6, well, there is no 6. So there's gonna be an what was it, array index out of bounds or something like that exception. So we have to be careful about that. But luckily there's some methods that we can use to make that less likely to happen. Same thing with negative index numbers. You can't have a negative because that doesn't make any sense. So now that I've shown you guys this, let's get into the code of it. So, and you can have an index of different data, or an array of different data types. But I'll start with an integer array because that's the simplest to understand. So the way that you would do it is you would type in the data type, and then you go on your keyboard to the square brackets, and then after the square brackets you do a space and you will name the array. So we'll just call this numbers. Okay. Now there are multiple ways to instantiate an array. You can basically it's mainly 2 ways. I mean, you have this way, but there's no value. You can also just give the values directly the way that I did there. So I'll just come up with new numbers. -67, sure. 1, 42, 2009, and -56. And you notice that these are curly braces here. Whenever you give values to the array upon its creation, you use curly braces instead of the square brackets. I didn't make the rules, that's just what it is. So we have to remember that. And so yeah, now I have an array here. And so now I can use these numbers. So let's system.out, our favorite command here. Now, if I want to access any of the numbers in here, I have to call the array and then call the element or index of the array that I'm looking for. So say I want to get the fourth element of the array. Okay, well then I type in numbers. Now I can print this, and I'll actually just do this first, and that's what you get, because you can't print the contents of the array just directly like that. There's other ways to do that. But if I want, oh, actually let's keep that. If I want, let's, like, what did I say, the fourth element, you might be tempted to type in 4 there, but 4 is incorrect for this case. But what you do is you type in the square brackets again, meaning it's an array. That's what lets Java know we're talking about an array now. And then we put in the fourth element, which is actually 3, because remember the address starts at 0. Then this is 1, then this is address 2, address 3, address 4. If we put in 4, we would get the fifth element in the array, and that's not what we want. We wanted the fourth element in the array. So we have to put in numbers 3. Okay, so if I save it and run it, we get 2009, because numbers array is this collection of integers, and the fourth element is 2009. So if I wanted negative 60, the first element, it's always 0. So that's something that you're going to have to get used to. Lists and arrays and collections and stuff like that always start with 0. Computers start with 0. So, and when I run that code, numbers index 0 is equivalent to negative 67. That's the value that I have stored in there. If I change the number and ran it, it's the same, or it's not the same, but I'm using the same address. But now that the value of that address has changed, well, our result is going to be different now. So I think that's pretty much it for, accessing elements of arrays and stuff like that. But what is the other way to create one? So let's show you guys that. So instead of the square brackets, say we know that we want an array and we know the size we want it to be, but we don't have the values yet. What do? Well, what we do is we type new int, so the data type again, and then we put the square brackets, and inside the square brackets we're going to list the size. So say I wanted 10 numbers. All right, now we have 10 numbers. If we run this code now, it's gonna be a 0 because it defaults all integers to 0. So it doesn't matter if we do index 6 or what, but all integers are defaulted to 0. And so we should give it values though. Now other data types, they some of them have defaults, like Booleans, I believe, default to false. But not everything has a default. So just be careful with that, especially when you're using objects, classes and objects and stuff like that. It will be a null, and it'll be a null pointer exception. So if we had, um, and I'll show you an example of that. So let's create some values here. So if I wanted to assign a value to a specific address or index in the array, I will call the array. So it's numbers. That's the name of the array. And do I need to make this bigger? Yeah, there we go. And we do our square brackets, and let's say I want it to be the first element, so element 0. This is a variable. We have to remember that this is a variable and we can treat it as such. So that means we can assign a value to it. So numbers 0 equals, let's say, 70. Okay, now if we print out the value of that, well, look, now we get 70. Remember, before it was 0. So we just changed the value here. We can do that for any of them. Numbers 7 equals 3, or 2, excuse me. And then, yeah, so let's print that out. 7. All right. Now an interesting thing is you can add these two numbers together. So we could do this one of two ways. We can create an integer here, just call it x, I guess, equals numbers 0 plus numbers 7. And like I said, because these are two variables, we can manipulate them and use them. And now we have another variable with that new value, and we can print that out. And we get 72. 70 from numbers index 0 and 2 from numbers index 7. And so now we could do it that way, or we could do it this way. Let's copy this or cut it. Paste it in there. And voila, 72. We get the same thing. So we didn't even have to do the intermediate step there. Now, let me show you how to do random. Now, a few lessons ago when we got user input, I taught you how to make a scanner object. And in Java, there's two ways to do random. You have random in the math class. It's not the random that I prefer. I prefer the random from the random class. And we have to make a random object first. So we have random, and we'll just call it R equals new random. So it's very similar to the scanner object. We don't put anything in there. Now we do have to import it. So we can hover over this and it'll tell us where to get it from. So I'll just type it java.util.random. Alright, and now we're good. Okay, so this random has methods, this random object has methods, just like the scanner object had methods. And so some of them are actually similar names. So let's say, and I got rid of my array here, so let's just create that again. Numbers equals new int, and let's just do 5. Okay, so we have an array of size 5, and we have our, and it's an integer array, and we have our random object here. So now all we need to do is populate this numbers array. So we could do numbers 0, and this is how we use our random object. We're going to say equals R, because that's the object here, the random object, dot, and now we have methods that we have access to. Now, because our array is an integer array, we want integers. So we're going to say next int. And we're actually going to use this method here. So it's the next int with a parameter here that we use. So we use this integer here to set a limit. We don't want the random number to be as much as this. And so this is an exclusive number. So if I put, let's say 100 here with a semicolon, it's going to go from 0 to 99. So the way that we would do, let's say 1 to 100, is we just add a 1 there on the outside. Okay. All right. Now if we wanted to do 0 to 100, we would just put 101 in there. All right. So I'm going to have this now, and we're going to do this for all of them. And I'll type it one more time. And then I'm going to copy it just to make this a little bit easier for me. All right, so 2, 3, and 4. All right, so this is our 5 numbers, and it's going to generate, this random object is going to generate 5 random numbers between 0 and 99, but the variables are going to contain values from 1 to 100. All right, then we're going to type them all out. Okay, and then I'm going to show you guys a better way to do all of this, and it's going to incorporate some of the things that we've learned. All right, let's do it. So let's go over the code again before we execute it. We create a random object, then we create an integer array with it's empty right now, or I guess they all technically have a 0, but empty, 5 integers. We set the values here to these random integers, and we're going to print them all out. So here's our output. We have 46 for the first one, 83, 85, 50, and 56. And you notice none of them were under 1, and none of them were over 100. I can run this many times, and I guarantee you the smallest output you'll see is 1, and the largest output you'll see is 100, even though we haven't gotten it yet. Oh, there's 1 there. So anyway, now let's do this the smart way. Okay, now we just learned about loops, so I think we should make use of them. We can use any of the loops to do this. So let's use a do while loop. So int, and we'll say index equals 0. Start it off at 0. Do. So what do we want to do? We want to assign the value of this array for each index of the array, and that's what this index variable does. It gives us a place in the array that we're manipulating, but also will allow us to break out of the loop. So let's say while index is less than or equal to 4, because the numbers array is size 5, which means it goes from 0 to 4. So we want to do this while it's less than or equal to 4. And what do we want to do exactly? We want to assign the current index of the array that we're at to a certain number. So I'll do the code and then I'll show you guys in Paint what I mean. So we have at 0, so we're going to do numbers, and then we're going to put index in here because this is our variable, and this is going to change. Numbers at this index, which is 0 right now, equals r, this is our random number here, our random object, excuse me, dot next int, and then we're gonna, let's just do let's put 11 in here, so I'll do 0 to 10. Alright, now we have to do one more thing. We have to make sure that we change the value of index, or we're going to be stuck in this loop forever, and we're only going to be dealing with this numbers array at the first index, index 0. So we say index plus plus. Alright, how does that look? I think that looks good. Let's run this code. But before we do that, let me show you what I mean. I wish I had a bigger eraser here. Oh well. So I guess it doesn't have to be perfect here. Okay. And finally, well, actually this index is not even going to be involved. We are going to just ignore this one here. Alright, so we're in our loop, right? And it's an integer array. So we're at index 0. That's the index we're at right now. So while index is less than or equal to 4, 0 is less than or equal to 4, numbers at index, so right now number 0, because that's what index is equivalent to. The value of index, this variable, is 0. We're going to just get a random number between 0 and 11. Alright, 7. Boom. Alright. Increment the value of index by 1. Alright, so now index is 1. All right, with it being 1, is that less than or equal to 4? Yes, it is. So we're going to go back into the loop again. Now numbers at index 1, which is the value of index currently, is going to be another random number. All right, we'll say 0. Cool. Increment index by 1. All right, now index is equivalent to the number 2. And 2 is less than or equal to 4, so we go back into the loop again. All right, this time we have 9. Random number. Increment the value of index. It's 3 now. 3 is less than or equal to 4. All right, 6. And then increment the value of index one more time, and it's 4. Is 4 less than or equal to 4? Yes, it is. So we do the loop one more time. Number 1. Increment the value of index again. It's 5. Is 5 less than or equal to 4? No, it's not. So at this point, this condition is false, meaning we break out of the loop. We don't do this anymore. And this is our random array. And that's it. So I'm going to minimize that. Now there's one thing that we have to do is we should print it out. So let's print out numbers index. All right. Now it's important, the ordering of these lines of code matters, because if we increment the value of index first, it's going to change the value of index 0, or change it to index 1, and we'll never change the value of index 0. We'll start off at 1 before we do anything else. We don't want to do that. We want to make sure we assign the value of the index first, then we want to print it out, then we want to change it. Now each situation is different, and there might be times when you might do things in a different order, but for what we're trying to do, this is the order that we need. So what I'm expecting here is to get 5 different numbers between 0 and 11. Random numbers every time the output should change. Alright, so we got 9, 3, 6, 9, 10, and they can be duplicates, as you can see. 0, 1, 2, 10, 0. So, different numbers, and that's what this random class is. Now, technically speaking, the random is not like truly random. It's pseudo-random, um, but it's random enough. It's good enough. Don't think it's not good enough. It's more than sufficient for most things. So that's the program there. We can use loops to go through the arrays, to assign values to arrays, and that's the power of looping. And now we have this number here to set, there's all kinds of ways that we can improve this program essentially. So say we know we want the number of elements to be, like I said, 5. It's not good programming practice to hard code numbers to things like this. It's good to set those variables and then use the variable in here. So we'll say number of numbers, I guess. That's fine, and we'll set that to 5. All right, and so with that, we'll just paste that on in there, and then boom. We have the same output, but if we have this stored into a variable now, and it's more robust of a program. If we had this several times throughout our program, we'd only have to change this number one time up here. So I think that's a better way of doing it. Also, we have this 4 here, okay, and so we don't need to change that. We can just do that minus 1. Okay, we don't have to make a new variable for that. We know that the size of the array is 5, and we know that the maximum index is going to be 1 less than that. So we can use a variable there, and it's just a better program now. Not so much in this case. We can do it the other way as we did, but this is better, especially if you have a larger program. And we can even do that here. Number threshold, and we'll call that 11. And we can put that in there. And now the only thing we really have hard coded is this. And again, it's just it's a variable, so we're just giving it that value. Sometimes it's unavoidable for things like that, but as you can see, the output is still working as intended, and I'm pretty satisfied with this program. Now, I told you that we can have arrays of different data types. So, sure, let's do a different array here. So let's keep this the same. Let's get rid of this, and let's do a Boolean array, and not call it numbers. We'll call it just array Boolean, and we'll just keep this variable the same even though we're not using numbers. And then we're going to keep this the same, but obviously the name of the array has changed. And then here we don't need a number threshold because we're dealing with booleans. It's just an on or off. So we're actually going to delete that, and then we're going to change this from r.nextInt to r.nextBoolean, and it'll randomly choose a true or false. Okay, and we run that and we get 4 trues and a false. Run it again, true, false, true, false, true. And so let's just explain that. Let's go over this real quick. So we have an integer variable, which is the number of numbers. We're going to use that to size our array. And so we have this Boolean array that we're creating, and it's a new Boolean. So it's an empty array, and like I said, I believe it defaults to false if I never set any of these. Yeah, that's correct. And we set our index to 0. So we start at the first index, and we assign the value to a random Boolean. We print it out, go to the next index, check to see if we're still in the loop here, and if we are, we do it again. So the looping is good. I mean, this array could be huge. It could be 5,000, and the computer will do it. I mean, if you look to see this scroll bar over here is small, it does it 5,000 times. The console won't show 5,000, but trust me, or I don't think it'll show. It might show 5,000. I could put a number on it, but I'm not going to do it. But yeah, trust me, it's 5,000. It did it 5,000 times. I can call this array and call any element in there, and it'll have a value. So same thing with, like I said, any data type. You can use longs, you can use doubles, you can use floats, characters, strings, and you can even use classes that you've created as a data type in your array. So I'll show you an example of that. Let's not make this 5,000. Let's just go back to 5. And so let's say I wanted to use my animal class that I made, I don't know, the second lesson. Well, I can do that actually. We can make an animal array. And let's name it animals. Or we could just keep it the same. That's fine. So I don't have to change this stuff down here. Now, we have an error now because it's not a new Boolean. It's a new animal array. Now you notice it has to be spelled exactly the same, and it is case sensitive. So we have the capital A there. Now, we can't actually do this random here, can we? Alright, so we can use a random, but the way that we're going to use it is we're going to use it for this constructor. So this animal constructor, when we want to create an animal, we have to use one of these constructors. And the constructor just tells Java how to make this animal object. So if we use this constructor, we'll take a Boolean, and the Boolean is whether or not it has eyes. So the way that this would work is you create a new object here. We're not using the random except just to generate the Boolean randomly. So remember, this is an array of animals. So we're creating a new animal object. So we need a new animal and with parentheses. Now this works because this would be calling this constructor, but we don't want to do that. So we want to, and like I said, it could work, but we want to call the other constructor with the Boolean. So we're going to say in the parentheses, it takes a Boolean. So we're just going to give it one. We're going to use our random dot next next Boolean, sorry. And that works. You could also just create a Boolean here, b, and equal that to r dot next int or next Boolean, and use b in here instead. But that's a little bit more work. This is cleaner and easier. But if that helps you, really flesh out the thought process, then by all means, it's not the wrong way to do it. And we have our same loop here. Now, if we try to print out these animals, it's going to print out some weirdness. And again, it looks very similar to how the array was when we printed that initial array. And that's because you can't really print an object that you create directly like that unless you do some things first, which we can go over at a later date. But that is all for arrays. Just one more thing to caution you guys about is once you create an array, you cannot resize it. So if you set it to be 5 at first, you can't go over that. So let's try to do that real quick. Let's use this number of numbers variable to try to create a new animal. And so what this would do is create 6 animals instead of 5. And it will try to place that 6th animal in an array size of 5. And we get an exception here and it's an array index out of bounds exception. And it's basically, it sounds like what it is. Index 5 is out of bounds for length 5. Because remember, the indexes start at 0 and not 1. So that's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are the 5. And so now we could to fix that, we can go less than 5 here and would be okay again. But got to make sure we're careful of that, and it can't be negative numbers as well. Alright guys, that just about does it for arrays. If you guys have any questions, please put them in the comments. If you have any specific topics you'd like me to cover, I'll do a video on it for you. Alright, have a good one.